So Tobago is another very small island. I felt like I had kind of another culture shock because it's part of Trinidad. It's further south. So just as far as the government, it's part of Trinidad. Trinidad and Tobago is considered a two-island nation. They're right off of the coast of Trinidad, just the upper right-hand corner. It's kind of a carrot-shaped island, and only really the bottom third of the island is largely populated. There's roads all the way around it, but the missionary work isn't hardly done because it is so difficult to get up there. I think missionaries there might have cars now, which makes it slightly easier, but at that time we were just using taxis or buses, and it's really time consuming to be able to get up there, and it's also really hard if you're teaching anybody like up at the top of the island because they can't really get to church because it is so long, and it's just such a big trip for them to get down to Scarborough. And Scarborough is the main city, and that's where our branch is held. So Tobago is a really interesting place. The people there, it is very quiet. It is a touristy island, but much less so than St. Martin. It's a really sunny place. It's more tropical, more leafy and green. It's a lot more humid. They get a lot more rain. And they're just kind of traditional people, so they're a little more stuck in their ways. They just like to do the things that they like to do. As one guy that we live next to, he put it that in Tobago, like a person might just keep going to the grocery store just right around the corner. Even if another one that's closer opens up and they have cheaper prices, they'll just keep going to the other one because their dad went to it and their grandfather went there, and so that's just how they're going to keep doing it. Just very traditional people, very religious people. The people in Tobago really are grounded in their churches. That's a big center of the community there. But still the same deal is that everybody is willing to receive the missionaries because they recognize that you're representing God. And so it made it a nice place to serve. I don't know, it's kind of a tough island just because of the various religions that are there. Some of them are a little harsher on missionaries than others, or just on other churches in general. But overall, I mean, it's a pretty similar place as much of the West Indies. You have a lot of the same ethnicities, cultural backgrounds, religious backgrounds there.
In Trinidad, it definitely is a one-of-a-kind experience. There's definitely like a lot of curry. There's something called doubles. Doubles is very unique to Trinidad, and they are amazing. It's very hard to explain, but it's basically two slices of kind of like this fried bread, and there's special. I don't know how to explain it. But if you ever get a double, if you don't like spicy, do not ask for pepper. And even if slight pepper, that's still pretty hot. So if you ate a lot of pepper, you'll cry. Like I had it the first time, I just had slight pepper, and my eyes were still watering. So, but definitely if you ever go to Trinidad, doubles is a must. They have a double stand right by the airport, so you should go there. The people, there's a lot of different jobs. There's so much. There's KFCs, Subways, McDonald's, like everywhere. There's social workers, there's hospitals. Something that's very interesting is something called a maxi. A maxi is kind of like a bus system. Depending on their color code is depending on where they're going, whether they go like east, west, north, south. And you pay for however long you're on it. Not like time-wise, but like for destination to destination. So it's kind of like a taxi, but like huge and just picks up everyone. There's also small, like actual taxis. On the license plate, you'll see whether or not they're just a normal car or whether or not they're a taxi. Because a normal car and a taxi look exactly the same except their license plate. And so you can just like wave out, and like a car will just stop by. And there might be other people in it, you'll just hop in. As missionaries, you kind of have to be careful. You should not hop in a taxi alone with a woman. I mean, you're alone in her car. Even if it's kind of public, it's not very public. It's kind of private. It's their own private taxi car. It's their car. There's not a clock in, a clock out. It's their own private most of the time. The Trinidadian dollar, there's about, for every 7 Trinidadian dollars is about $1 US. And so, like I saw some Trinidadian money. Most missionaries try and get the $50 bill because it's the coolest. It's like partly see-through. Probably the culture. One of the biggest things they're famous for is carnival. So if you've ever seen the movie Rio, they have like carnival that they show in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Trinidad is like probably the second best in the world after Rio de Janeiro. There's a part where like missionaries just can't leave their apartment for like extended period of time because like it's not okay to go on the streets. So there's a lot of, it's normally around February and March. So there's a lot of excitement there. There's like a whole bunch of prep for that. People get excited. It's definitely part of their culture. So it's very, you see a lot of people, especially when it's their first carnival, being a member. It's kind of different for them. There's definitely a lot of crime in Trinidad, but I'm sure that's like wherever you go. There's just like, something that's very interesting is that you, being a white female, they just kind of like stare at you sometimes because like, you're so beautiful. So sometimes they'll just give you free stuff. So the sister missionaries, we give us free stuff sometimes. There are men who have like coolers of soda or their fruit. And so at big stoplights, when it's backed up, they will come out and just go car to car trying to sell, if that makes sense. So that's pretty frequent. In Trinidad, they drive on the left side of the road. So that's, so just be prepared for that if you have to drive. You can get your Trinidad driver's license, actually. It's kind of cool to take home. If white shirts, long sleeve means that you're the boss. Short sleeve means that you're kind of like an assistant. And so, of course, we wear short sleeve most time as missionaries. But if you do receive like more respect in businesses if you wear long sleeve. So most of the time when you'd work in the office, you'd wear long sleeve. And if you're going to go do certain things, the financial secretary most of the time wears long sleeve whenever he makes financial transaction at a bank. And that's something that most people don't know. So it's kind of only the businessmen know. Let's see where the mission home is. It's one of the most nicest places in Trinidad. A lot of people will build their own homes. They will take concrete bricks and build them. And most of them, like a lot of people I taught, were living in homes that their father built. Or they just made an addition on to the house and their dad lives still on part of the house. They live on the other part. They just made an addition. So that's one thing, is that also Trinidad is very big on family. They have a lot of family gatherings. And a lot of people really do believe in God. So there's a lot of people that are Hindu and Muslim. There's something called Indian Expo where people from India actually come over to Trinidad. And so you can buy a lot of things. It's kind of like a bargaining. So my first time I kind of felt bad because like I was like trying to talk them down. Like, no, like Indian Expo, like I don't want to pay this much money for this much, but you're supposed to talk them and talk them down the price at least. And so it is very, very interesting. You do have to receive like the First Presidency's permission if the family is very, very Muslim, because they can be targeted if they become a Christian. Hindus, they are just so open. They're like the nicest people. And most of the time the members that were Hindu and then converted, they are one of the strongest because they really learned who Christ was. And they have a very strong testimony of him. And so because of that, sometimes you will be teaching people that do not know who Jesus Christ is. Most of the time they might have heard about him, but not known him seriously. Most Muslims know who Jesus Christ is because they consider him a prophet. So just be prepared for that. Be prepared for, there's a lot of drinking in Trinidad, but it's just something very common people drink. It's just not I don't think you should be scared of it. Just like be prepared. There's a lot of Rastas. Just like go with the flow, one love, man. So I would say that's probably a lot of main highlights from Trinidad.
So after that, I went to Trinidad. That's where I finished my mission. I served in a place called Curup. And Trinidad's awesome. A stake was just organized there about 4 or 5 years ago. And that was the only time I served in a ward. And it was really, really cool. The people there are awesome. Trinidad's will just feed you till you die. And so I really like that. Their food's the best. Lots and lots of Indian people there, lots of Hinduism. But it was a really good place. It's a lot busier. Grenada was just a really quiet place. There was one main road that wound around the whole island. There's like one traffic light, just nothing. And Trinidad is a lot more Americanized, They have Wendy's there, which obviously makes it like America, and traffic lights. So it's a good place. It's a lot different, but it's a good place. And the people there are a lot more similar to Grenadians. So
my first country I served was Trinidad, and Arima was my first area I was in. Love Arima. Arima's amazing. And so we're in Arima, and it was the time, so I went down December of 97, so I guess it must have been January, February, March, one of those 3 months, because I was there for about 4 or 5 months. They have Carnival, and they have it every year. Carnival is it's a huge party in the whole country. Businesses will actually board up their windows. Any glass windows they have, they'll board them up and close their business down for the however many days Carnival is. And the instruction we got as missionaries was we were not allowed to go out during Carnival. We had to stay indoors. And I don't know how long it was. I'm guessing 3 or 4 days Carnival lasted. And so we had to stay indoors. The mission president wanted us to read the entire Book of Mormon during those 3 to 4 days. So that's what we did for 3 to 4 days. We read the entire Book of Mormon from cover to cover. And they say that that cabin fever is a myth. Some people say that, and it's not a myth. 3 to 4 days in your apartment and not being able to leave it was horrible. I mean, even though we had the Book of Mormon there to read, wasn't enough. Okay, we had to get out of there. So as soon as Carnival was done, and I think from our window, there was another building that was there, and then there's one of the main streets, and then another building. I think we were able to see 3 inches of Carnival and see people walking by and everything. And so we saw itsy bitsy amount. But we even heard from the locals that not a good idea to go out during Carnival. That there's people everywhere, and I wish I could tell you more about Carnival, but I don't know anything about it. Maybe just seeing a few feathery things go by, but I heard there's a lot of immorality and suggestive things that go on, and so that's why they board things up. It gets pretty crazy. Lots of drinking and it's a huge party. It's a huge college party, I guess you could think of, and that's But Trinidad is very tropical and very it's the tropics meets the city. There's a lot of nice cities that you go through, lots of busy cars, but Trinidad's awesome. Amazing food again, just like all the other stuff. It's the best food I've ever had.
I lived in Barbados. So I served in Grenada for about 10 months. And then I went to Barbados and I served there for 3 or 4. And it was pretty interesting because Grenada and other islands like St. Vincent and Trinidad are all very similar, but Barbados is kind of out here a little bit different than the rest. Their accent is a lot different. After going from Grenada, I had a really hard time understanding what they were saying in Barbados. A lot more heavily influenced by like English or Scottish accents. It's a lot better off. It's a lot wealthier than Grenada was, and they really like eating fish. Tons and tons of it. Whereas in Grenada, they ate mostly just like curried chicken or stewed chicken and the stuff called oil down. Something that was cool about Barbados, the people were just so funny there. Tons of Jehovah's Witnesses. Tons. So it always made contacting really, really interesting. You don't knock on people's doors. You call in. And so you just call in and you'd say, "Good day" inside. And they'd come out and talk to you on the street and stuff. It was a pretty interesting place. And the church there's just these 3 small branches organized into a district. And most of the people were converted in England and then moved back, because lots of Bajans, they get to like their 20s and then they move to England or to the States. And then once they've made a lot of money, they come back and retire to Barbados. And so it was the only branch I served in where just 95% of them were 50 or over. It was pretty funny. But it was a really good place.
So Barbados, another wonderful place with one of the things that all the West Indies islands, at least the ones I served in, and from talking to the other missionaries, seems to be the same thing as the best people you'll ever meet and the best food you'll ever meet. And in Barbados, they have a lot of flying fish. Flying fish is a very big a food that's there, and you'd find a lot of places that would fry flying fish, and it's fantastic food that they prepare down there. Lots of food places everywhere. You can go down the street. There's food everywhere, and dominoes was a big popular game down there. So not stacking them up and knocking them down, but there's actually the actual game of dominoes, which I guess is kind of you create this this little chain of matching up different dominoes, and so you could hear from blocks away people playing it, because when they're getting ready to put down their domino, they would smack it down and put it in order. And that's so you hear this smack down, and there's a few missionaries that got really good at dominoes and would walk down and we'd start talking to them, and they'd be like, "Nah, we're playing a game. We don't want to talk to the missionaries." So we'd say things like, "Well, what if we beat you at dominoes? Then will you talk to us?" And that would do it. So some missionaries would beat these guys. These guys have been playing since they were kids, but some of the missionaries were good. Most of us could not beat them. Most of us were not very good at it. I was not very good at it, but they enjoyed playing with us anyway. And even when we'd challenge them and we'd lose, they would, let's hear what you have. You guys are funny guys. And then we'd play with them. But notice that I haven't talked about the beaches, because you can't go to the beaches, obviously, while you're a missionary. But you will pass the beaches, and you will see the water and the beautiful beaches, but you can't go. If you do go to Barbados, one thing that we did, and we got permission from our mission president to do it. We got permission from somebody to do it. We didn't just do it. But, you have your area, and any mission you go to, from what I understand, you kind of have to stay within your boundaries. And anytime you go outside your boundaries, there's extenuating circumstances. Well, Barbados, if you look up how big it is, it's a pretty small island. So, but what we wanted to do, we wanted to ride our bikes from one end to the other end, and back to our apartment, and we did that. And it was amazing. It was so amazing. We saw every landscape of Barbados possible, all the different geographical looks that the country can offer. All the way to the end of the island, there's a big cliff, and then you just see the ocean far away. I think it was a field, if I remember correctly, a big field, and then just a cliff. It wasn't a beach. And then the tip of the island, the other tip, and probably maybe 3/4 of the rest of the island is probably beaches. But at the far north end, where we were, at least, where we rode our bikes to, it was just a nice empty cliff. It was kind of like you came to the end of the world and then had to go back. We spent a little time there. I think we had a lunch or whatever and came back. And it was during our P Day. But if you can get your mission president to approve that, definitely a great experience that I'll never forget, is my bike ride across Barbados and back.
St. Lucia was definitely one of my favorite areas. I think just because, all the places in the West Indies are beautiful for different reasons. And I found that St. Lucia was the prettiest because it was the best combination. It had lots of mountains, it had lots of trees, but then the beaches are really nice and the water is just pristine. So St. Lucia was really nice. At the time that I was serving there, they've since expanded it a lot since the surge of missionaries. When I was serving there, I was moved in as a zone leader, and we had 2 companionships in the north part of the island. The main city there is called Castries, and there's a Castries, we just had 1 and 2. And so my companion's area was a little bit further north, and that was honestly in the richer part of the island, which I think was also kind of why I liked it, just because it was pretty. Places like Rodney Bay and Gros Islet, they have lots of resorts, like the Sandals resorts are big around there, and there's lots of really nice homes, people that will just choose to live in St. Lucia because it's that nice. And that was mostly the area that we took. Castries, the city in itself, the other companionship would work that more. That was just the boundaries. And then on the southern part of the island, we had another 2 companionships, 1 set of elders and 1 set of sisters, in a place called Vieux Fort. Vieux Fort is much more poor, it's much more rural. I say rural, and people, that conjures to the mind that there's like a lot of distance, but honestly, it's not. It's just that there's not as much of a city populace there. It's very, very poor. Just complete contrast with my area, where people live in very expensive homes. There's nice marinas and resorts. In Vieux Fort, it's really poor. They have a place called Shantytown, and people live in very small board houses, just zinc, steel fences and things like that. It made it for kind of an interesting place. There was just like all walks of life and really big economic disparity wherever you went. You might have like a really bad neighborhood right next to a very, very wealthy neighborhood, just on such a small island. It was pretty interesting. It has a lot of French roots, because the French had owned it. They also speak a language called patois there. Each different island has kind of their own version of it. It's different than Jamaican patois or others because it's French based. Those who spoke French could pick it up pretty easily. Those who spoke English, we had no idea what was going on. But again, that was more of a spoken language, and it was kind of outdated. So there was very few people, unless they were very, very old, that spoke patois exclusively. It was mostly people who just had kind of learned it because their parents had just spoken it growing up, and so they had just learned both languages. As for St. Lucia, the people there are very, very nice. Honestly, I really, really love St. Lucians. Their accent is really interesting too because it is French based, so they sound different than a person from St. Martin or a Tobagonian. Everybody sounds different because their accents are all different. In St. Lucia, the food that they are really known for is more of their bakery items. In Trinidad and Tobago, you'll hear more about roti, which is an Indian food, curry, types of things like that, doubles, which is a street vendor type food. Up in St. Lucia, they don't have a whole lot of that, but their bakeries are really, really good. One item that the missionaries loved is something called a turnover. It's about this big. You can think of it as like a donut. It's basically what it is. It has just like coconut and melted sugar on the inside, and just kind of flip the dough in on itself. And so that's the thing that you would buy just from street vendors or from bakeries and stuff all the time. And that was probably one of my favorite things about St. Lucia was the food. It was really good.
Yeah, Grenada, it's just north of Trinidad. And so after serving 10 months in Guyana, I was sent to Grenada. And in Grenada, when I got there was 4 companionships. And there's 2 companionships that were in St. George's. That's the capital of Grenada. And that is where the branch is. And then there was a companionship in Guave. And there was a companionship that just barely opened up kind of the province of Grenville. Just a little town up there. And so there was actually, this is interesting, sisters. They're sisters in the mission, and they'll serve mostly on the islands, but the sisters wouldn't serve in Guyana. So going to Grenada, it was my first interactions with actually having like sisters in my mission. And after being on my mission for a year, it was kind of weird, like getting used to having like these sister missionaries around, serving in the same branch. But probably the coolest thing about like the location of the church in Grenada is that they bought this building it's a beachfront property, and they converted it into the church. And so if you go to the back of the church, you have this view of the beach and the ocean. You can kind of see the island jutting out. And it's the most amazing view on the entire island. And it's just like you're sitting in church, pondering the truths of eternity. And there you're looking into the ocean and the sun, the sunrise and the sunset. And it's a very beautiful country. So going from Guyana, where there was trash in the streets and there was garbage everywhere, to going to Grenada, where it was kind of like this paradise. It was kind of an interesting change and experience for me, but even though my heart is still in Guyana, I love that place. But yeah, with Grenada, I served in St. George's for the 4 months that I was there, and we actually lived in this area called Tempe. And since then the missionaries have moved, but it was on the very top of this hill. And to get home at night, there was this hillside that it had to have been at least like this steep, and there was 200 steps up the side of this hill, and we called it the steps to Mordor, and we'd hike them every single night. And by the time you got home, it was just like, it was the easiest thing to lay down in bed and fall asleep. Like I had no problem falling asleep. And that goes for the whole time I was on Grenada, just because we walked everywhere, and there's still public transportation, just like there was in Guyana, where you pay the bus driver just a few dollars and they'll take you really anywhere. But yeah, I walked a lot in Grenada. So when you go to Grenada, that's what you should expect, to walk up and down hills like all day. I didn't mention some of the food that you're going to find in these places. The race that's most prevalent in Grenada is African, and so they'll do a lot of like one of their like main dishes is oil down, and so like in this dish they'll throw in like potatoes, and they'll throw in pig snout and pigtail, and this vegetable called breadfruit, and they just throw it in this big pot, and then you throw dumplings inside with it. And so we ate that a lot, and it's kind of some mixed reviews. Some people like it, some people don't. I was the type of missionary who I loved eating anything, and so we ate a lot of fish in Grenada, because there's a lot. That's how a lot of people get their living, is through fishing. And actually, Guave is a fishing town, and some people might not know, but Karani James, he's the Olympic champion in the 400. And he is 400 meters, and he's from Guave, like this tiny little fishing town. So it's amazing that even like you can find the most amazing people just like in these small little obscure places. And that's what I learned about a lot of these islands, is that, you know, there's some of like God's most precious children, you know, just sitting out on these little islands. And I love reading through the scriptures and the portions where it talked about like the isles of the sea. You know, it just felt really cool to be a part of, you know, that area of the world, that I was on these islands. You know, we're just like, you know, God's children. We're just in these little remote places. But yeah, I mean, some other facts about Grenada. My time in Grenada, the nutmeg is it's the highest, I guess the thing that they produce the most of, and they export it out of their country. So whereas in Guyana they export sugar cane, in Grenada they export nutmeg, which is so odd. Like I didn't like this random island in the Caribbean, and it produces nutmeg. And so you can actually go to like these forests where like the nutmeg is found, and they have this huge factory, and you can go through the nutmeg factory and learn all about it. So that was really interesting. And so they'll get a lot of their income from selling nutmeg, and it's actually a huge tourist place. So you're going to get all of these cruise ships that come into Grenada, and so a lot of the locals, they'll actually go to the beaches, and they'll have created like bracelets and necklaces or T-shirts, and they'll sell all of these things to the tourists that are coming in. So that was interesting, seeing tourists. That was the first time I'd ever kind of had any interaction with them on my mission.
So Grenada is the most wonderful place on earth. They call it the Isle of Spice, where everything's nice, because most of its exports are in spices, like nutmeg. Nutmeg is a symbol on their flag, and you can just find it everywhere on the ground, right? And so that's kind of their claim to fame, is the spices there. They've also got really, really beautiful beaches, you know. It's a pretty small island. There are about 110,000 people who live there. And to get from the southernmost point to drive on a windy road to the northernmost point, it's about 25 miles. So it's pretty small. And most of the population lives on the southern part of the island. St. George's is the capital. And then you have a couple cities up north, but the majority of the population is down south. If you live up north, they call that living in the bush, or in the countryside is how they call it. The culture there is just so interesting. It's a lot different than the States. They're very open, and they're very willing to talk to you and to share with you and to invite you in. They're not very warm about it. But that's just kind of how, once you get to know them, you realize that's just their mannerisms, right? I think as Americans, we're super friendly and smiley, and we always like to show our affection and stuff. And they're not like that. They're a lot more reserved, is probably a better way of saying it. They're very reserved. I just call Grenada like the Rasta Island. So Rastafarianism is this big thing there. Bob Marley and, you know, the red, yellow, and green colors for that kind of culture. That's really, really strong there. That whole, just really laid back, really easygoing. So it's pretty cool. I think my favorite thing about Grenada, of course, was just the people. They just have really good hearts. They're awesome. I was in really poor areas the whole time, and it was just really cool to work with those people who oftentimes just had really good attitudes despite the circumstances they were in. They're very, very religious. No matter what their circumstances are, they always give thanks to God, and they always praise God. And you'll say, well, how do you know God's real? And they'll say, well, I had breath this morning, you know? Just really good attitudes. So it was pretty good. It's also a hard place to serve. And this applies to the whole Caribbean because their lifestyle is just at total odds with the principles of the gospel. Most people smoke weed, which has to do with the Rastafarianism, right? And the dreadlocks, they like to do that. But when they receive that witness of the gospel, it's really cool to see what they're willing to do to change. So it was a really, really awesome experience living there. It's English speaking, but it's not. They have their own dialect of it. And so when I first got to the mission, I couldn't understand what locals were saying. Even if they were like educated at the airport and their job was to speak to foreigners, I could not understand a thing. The accents are so thick. And then especially once we got into the more of the poorer areas that were a lot less educated and more detached from sort of like Americans and tourists and stuff, the language is just, it's English, but it's not, if that makes sense. It's sort of their own form of Ebonics. It's pretty interesting. Get ready, you just gotta listen. I mean, you'll get the hang of it just talking to them and stuff. I never really got down how to speak like that, but I could understand them pretty well. Just to immerse yourself in it, that's really the only way to learn it. Unfortunately, there's no Grenadian slang dictionary, so, you know, just gotta learn it as you go. English is their first language. I know that there are places in the mission, for instance in St. Lucia, where they speak patois, which is a mix of English and their native tongues that came with them from Africa, because most of them are the descendants of slaves who were transported to the West Indies. And so, yeah, kind of interesting.
So, like I said, there's a very heavy metropolitan influence. So you have a lot of the French food, like the baguettes and the patisseries and stuff like that, as well as like some of the more popular like French dishes, like beef bourguignon and stuff like that. But you mostly get those in restaurants and things like that. The local food is definitely a lot more Creole. One of my very favorite dishes that you can only get on Guadeloupe was boquetes. And boquetes, oh my gosh, they're amazing. It's like you take this deep fried scone type bread, and it's its own special recipe. And you basically like cut into that and stuff it full of like hamburger meat, steak, ham, you know, whatever you're craving. And then like fried egg on top of that. Like sliced up hot dog, bacon if you want it, and then like lettuce, tomato, and ketchup, and their special sauce, their pima, pepper sauce. And it's just so good. It's like a heart attack on a bun, but it's so, so good, delicious, and you can only get it on Guadeloupe. But yeah, as far as like other foods, one of the most popular dishes that we had, like it was actually kind of a guest dish, so the members would serve it to us a lot when they had us over to teach a lesson or things like that, was chicken colombo. And that's kind of a curry chicken dish served over rice. Very, very good, like very tender. Kind of like it's I wouldn't exactly call it Caribbean. It's like I would almost say it's like Indian influence, which, you know, if you go to Guyana, there's like a lot of Hindu people there, so maybe that's where it comes from. But yeah, that was a popular guest dish that we would be served when we went to members' houses. Since they are French, they try to have a little bit of salad with every meal. So, and that could be anything from like, you know, vegetables and tomatoes to like peppers, whatever they have handy. Bread is a very important part of the culture. Like the boulangeries are open every day, and so you could go get a baguette for very cheap and have it with a meal, or make a meal of it if you want. Some of the pastries were different because like they have a lot of different fruits on the islands. So like some of the pastries would be like fruit tarts with guava jelly or mango jelly versus what you would normally have like raspberry or strawberry if you were in Metropole. They also had a lot of local juices and everything, so that was always one of my favorite parts of going to the market, is you could just get like guava juice or passion fruit juice. You could get fruit, like just walking down the street there were fruit trees everywhere, so that was awesome. But yeah, that's pretty standard for what the food was. Lots of chicken, lots of they even had like a lot of like Jamaican jerk food as well, but yeah, my favorite was always Bokeats. I don't know if it's too crazy, but one of the ones that I had that it seemed to be served in most restaurants was pigtail soup. So it actually didn't taste too bad. It was just like something that I wasn't used to, is they would like include the entire pigtail in the soup. And so sometimes you would get like part of the, you know, the curly tail, and it would still have the bone in it, and like sometimes pieces of hair. So not my favorite dish, but not bad. Something they served like around the holidays that was pretty popular was acres de moru, which is basically like fish, not nuggets exactly, but like these fish filled pastries that were really, really good. And that's kind of like something they serve more around the holidays or on special occasions. Oh, something else that was delicious. It's kind of a Haitian dish. Basically, it's plantains that you smash into chips and then deep fry. They're delicious. But yeah, like, so you had different dishes from different cultures, and you also had like, you could go get kebabs and shawarmas and things like that. So just a nice little mix of different things you could get. But yeah, just it was all good food. Something I will say, I didn't have this. Like one of the missionaries I had served with, after they moved into our apartment when we changed areas, our landlord fed them all the time, and she once fed them soup like that was a lot like the pigtail soup, but instead of pigtail, it had the genitalia from a cow in it. So that was fairly interesting. They, like I said, that I didn't have that myself, but they described it as a very interesting experience themselves. You can buy all kinds of French pastries. Like our first mission president, his favorite pastry was a millefeuille, which means 1,000 sheets. It's like a layered cake-like pastry that's really good. You can always get like pain au chocolat, which is just like fried bread with chocolate in it, which is very good. There are always like tarts and things like that. Like I said, there's more of a local influence with some of them, like more fruit-based food, since they have a lot. Seriously, you can get fruit everywhere, so that's always a great snack. They have, and some of the fruits that were different, like they have guava, they have lots and lots of mangoes, they have star fruit, passion fruit, huge variety. So whatever you want, basically. Guadeloupe is definitely one of the bigger islands in the mission. It's the locals actually call it Karukara, which in Creole means butterfly, because the two have it's really two islands, but it's called one island, but it's really two, and it's separated by like a very small little rivulet. But yeah, like there's Basse-Terre and Grande-Terre, and they really are like shaped like two wings of a butterfly, which is how the island gets its name. And I served all over the island. I served in, I think, 5, maybe 6 areas on Guadeloupe, and each area is a little different. I did serve in the capital, which is Basse-Terre, which is on the southernmost point of the island, and then I served also in Pointe-à-Pitre, which is, I'd say it's the busiest part of the island, the busiest city. And then I served in smaller areas as well. So it's different just depending on where you go. It's beautiful. Like, it's seriously the most beautiful place I've ever been. Very green, very lush, very gorgeous to drive through. As far as like daily life goes, it's very much like France in many ways, just because like they have the same shops and stuff like that. Like the main grocery store is liter price, which is the same as it is in France. They import a lot of their same goods from France, but they also have a lot of like local markets where you can buy fresh fruit and other goods. And that was always one of my favorite parts, just because there's like the weather on the island is fairly, well, I felt like it was fairly constant in the heat and humidity. If you ask the locals, it gets colder in winter. I didn't think so, but it gets colder in winter. As far as like crime and safety goes, like I never had much of a problem with anything like that on my mission. There were some elders that were in the more populated parts of the islands that got robbed quite a few times, which was unfortunate. But for the most part, like since it's controlled by the French government, it's more they have a stronger governmental influence than some of the other islands, like some of the English islands, where they only have like their own government for the island. But you can definitely see that with Guadeloupe and Saint Martin, Martinique, there's a very strong metropolitan influence from France. As far as like what people do, there are like a lot of the members had construction jobs. Some of them had like jobs as nurses, teachers, stuff like that, like stuff we would do here. There are a lot of refugees on the islands, just from different islands, like trying to get a better life. Like the economy on the French islands is better than it is on a lot of the other places. So we had a lot of members that were refugees that would work more like under the radar jobs, like construction jobs or things like that. You also had a lot of members that would own like their own shop, a convenience store or a boulangerie, stuff like that. So I don't know, it's pretty diverse, just depending on where you're at. There's definitely an interesting mix of French culture and Caribbean culture. The French they're warm people, but they're kind of closed off when you first get to know them. And the Caribbean culture is kind of the opposite. They're very, very warm up front and a little more standoffish. Well, not standoffish, but a little more private, kind of like we are in the U.S. when you get to know them. So it was a very interesting cultural mix, because you never knew like which side of the culture the person you talked to would be on. So you could talk to someone, they'd be very happy to see you, or you could talk to someone and they'd be very closed off. So I don't know, just that part of it was pretty interesting, I thought.
Living in Guadeloupe was really incredible. It was a great place for me to start my mission. Like I said, the people are so kind. They were very forgiving about my limited French abilities, and they were very receptive to talking about God and Jesus Christ. They loved being able to learn more about them and talking about who they really were. In Guadeloupe, it is a larger island in the mission, and it's actually kind of shaped like a butterfly. There are two halves. One is called Grande Terre, and the other is called Basse Terre. I started on Grande Terre in the area of Abimes, in the Abimes branch. We were on bikes in my first area, and it's a little bit hilly, but not too bad. It is very hot year-round, and in Guadeloupe, a lot of times it will rain in the mornings, but be sunny in the afternoon, which was nice for us. We avoided most of the rain just by doing our studies in the morning, and then we got the sun in the afternoon. However, it rains year-round, and it's just kind of something you have to deal with when you're on bikes or in a walking area. Guadeloupe is very green. It is beautiful. Guadeloupe has very beautiful beaches and just a great scenery as a general statement. When I later returned to Guadeloupe in the last half of my mission, I served in Basse-Terre in Baie-Mau, the branch of Lamottin. In Basse-Terre, it is very hilly. There are lots of mountains, and everything is covered in green, in trees and bushes and grass. It's amazing. One of the cool things about Basse-Terre is there is a live volcano and called this La Soufrière. And so one of the common P-Day activities is to go and hike La Soufrière. I personally was never able to do it, but I hear that it's quite the experience.
There were some large spiders called banana spiders that I just see on their big webs between the trees and just sitting there. And there were, so there were all sorts of insects. And one of my companions found this giant centipede thing. The only encounters I had with wildlife there was the cockroaches, really, because they'd be in our house, and it wouldn't be unusual to go in the morning, take a shower, and there are 2 dead cockroaches in the bottom of the shower. But Jamaica has tons of fruit that grows locally, and it's the best fruit I've ever had. So like they're oranges. They look dirty on the outside, but they tasted amazing. And there were mangoes in my last area. There were mango trees everywhere, and we would just eat mangoes as snacks. And then the food they like to cook, they like rice and chicken a lot. In fact, I think McDonald's tried to start some franchises there, and they failed because the people don't really eat hamburgers. And there was one Burger King I knew of, but KFC did really well in Jamaica. So there's chicken products, and so one of the local dishes which they had very often and which I loved was called rice and peas. It was just rice, and then what they called peas were actually like kidney beans. So it's rice mixed with peas, various seasonings, these tiny, extremely spicy peppers, they called Scotch bonnets, and then coconut milk, and thyme, and they cooked that, I think, for several hours, but it was delicious, and so that was often served with either fried chicken, curry pork, or beef. And so beyond that, the food I had was pretty usual. So Jamaica had largely been Americanized, so when we went shopping, I could buy things I ate at home. The thing that surprised me the most about Jamaica was just all this fruit I'd never seen or heard of. So there's breadfruit, which grew on a tree. It is green on the outside, but when you cut it open, it's kind of yellow-brown, and you can fry it, and it tastes just like bread once it's cooked. And then there's another fruit called ackee. So it comes in these red pods, they call them ackee pods, and it has this yellow material around a little seed. And so if you pull out the yellow stuff and fry it, it tastes just like eggs. And then there were giant avocados. So I've had avocados in the States that are like the size of a fist, but there they were the size of a cantaloupe. And so one of the locals said, this is one of the few places in the world where bread and butter grows on the trees. So just because the avocados are so fatty, and they were delicious. I love avocados. And then other fruits, there were what they called star apples. And so they're kind of long. They looked a little like bananas on the outside, but if you cut them down the middle, they have a star shape in the middle, and they taste more similar to apples than anything else. And then there were also fruit they called jackfruit, and they were giant. So they would get larger than watermelons, and they grow right on the trunk of the tree. And those things were extremely sweet. You break them open, and they just have little sections, and you pull it out, it tastes like, the closest thing I can think of is Laffy Taffy. Just very sticky and sweet. And the sugar cane grew all over the place, and eating that is just like chewing on a piece of wood that had been soaked in sugar water. I guess another fruit I can think of is one that they called the star fruit, and it tasted really good, but the texture was kind of gross. So it is a big purple ball, and what you do to eat it is cut off the top, and then you just kind of squish the guts into your mouth, and then of course they had a lot of coconut there, and a common thing they did was take a coconut before it was ripe, and it just had water in the middle, and they would cut off the top, and kind of how they would refresh themselves. The taxis aren't really regulated, and the taxi drivers are paid by how many people they carry, so they usually stuff as many people as they can in a car. So that's just something I didn't expect. But so I mean, you sit in a car and then someone sits on top of you, and, but it wasn't that bad. And let's see, I was never in a wreck, and no one I knew was in a wreck, but so the roads were usually quite narrow, at least in the areas where I served, and they would go 80 miles an hour down them, and they were good drivers. So I don't know, I guess my advice would be that you're generally in good hands, even though it's scary sometimes. I never served in Kingston, but it is a large city, and I can't remember the population. So the population of Jamaica as a whole is 2 million, and in Kingston had to have at least 100,000. So and Jamaica is a very mountainous island. It's a volcano island, and so Kingston kind of sprawled all these foothills, and I remember the mission president lived in one of the few richer areas, and it seemed like there were rich neighborhoods and then poor ones, and there wasn't really much in between. So there's quite a contrast, and most of the area was quite poor. Then I remember, I think it was my second day in Jamaica, we went to pick up some food, and it kind of shocked me because I had been spoiled by the American restaurants, and we went in, and so there's a counter, and then a menu like normal, and it's handwritten, and then we could see where they just had a little stove, and they were cooking rice and chicken on it, and they gave it to us in a little styrofoam dish. But it was just very simple, and yeah, that's really all I remember of Kingston. So I only went there when I arrived on the island, and then when I left, essentially. I guess before I say anything in it, let me preface those things. The mission president encouraged us not to speak patois, because for people who did not grow up speaking it, trying to speak it just makes you sound like you're 2 or 3. Like you don't sound very intelligent, and so. But I understood it very well. So common phrases were or greetings, like wagwan, which is, I guess, a big contraction of what's going on. And a common response was midea, which means I'm here, basically, like midehe. And then, let's see, what other phrases, and then there were other words they had, like nuff, they'd say a lot, which just means a lot. So one thing I remember, we taught a member, or we've made visits to a member who had a lot of kids, and people would say he has nuff pickney, which just means he has a lot of kids. So, and then one phrase I heard someone say was "me hungry till me tripe dem al twist," and it just meant he was really hungry. I think the biggest issue was the law of chastity. So most of my mission I taught single mothers, and then so the men weren't really raised to be men. They didn't really have expectations of getting married and raising a family. A lot of the men were more interested in just drinking and playing games. And then, so in Kingston, there were several suburbs of Kingston where gangs ruled, called Marysville and Trenchtown. So the cops didn't even go in there, and gangs just ran the whole place. And so the church doesn't send sister missionaries to Jamaica because it is dangerous. Outside the tourist areas, most of the people live in poverty. So that I think the country works quite hard to keep the tourist areas looking nice and presentable. But I taught a lot of people who lived in little, what they called tin shacks by the side of rail lines, where they could gather materials and things. So typically the temperature is between 75, 85 degrees, and it always stayed in that area night and day. It was very humid, and then it rained fairly frequently. The Jamaicans said there's a wet season and a dry season, but I don't know that I could tell the difference between the two. So, but when it rained, it rained hard and long. For days, it rained constantly and torrentially, and I remember so most of the people don't like going out in the rain, so they always thought we were crazy when we walked through the rain, and we didn't carry umbrellas, because we rode bikes a lot, and then during one part of my mission, a hurricane came. So it was a lighter storm, as I heard. But we stayed in a house with, I think, there's 2 other companionships, so there's 6 elders in the house for 3 days. We didn't go out or teach or just hold up while it rained constantly, and the wind blew quite hard. They're kind of a more laid back culture, and just like if it happens, it happens. And when we ask people to come to church, they say, "Oh, God willing, I'll make it." And like they didn't. Most of them didn't care if we were late for appointments, or like if we showed up for an appointment. Like they weren't too concerned about exact times and things like that.